The workers entered through the basement of a saloon. That is how it began. Not with a ceremony, not with a public announcement, not with the city's knowledge or its consent, but through a trapdoor somewhere in the loop, a hole cut into the floor of a drinking establishment, a ladder descending into the blue clay 40 feet beneath the streets of Chicago, and men going down it in the middle of the night with long-handled scooping knives to carve out the interior of the city. The clay they brought out came up after midnight and went onto wagons in the dark. By morning, nothing had visibly changed on the street above. The saloon opened, the city went about its business, and somewhere below it, the excavation resumed. The year was 1899, which is close enough to 1897 that what follows is a story drawn from the same period, the same city, and the same logic of concealment that the title of this piece conjures. Whether a specific block was purchased to cover a discovery depends on how liberally you define discovery, how literally you mean purchase, and how broadly you read the word cover. By all those definitions, what happened beneath the loop of Chicago in those years qualifies thoroughly. An entire underground city was uncovered, then built, then operated in secret, then abandoned, then forgotten so completely that when it tried to announce its own existence in 1992 by flooding the basements of every major building in the downtown, nobody in city government could immediately explain where the water was coming from. To understand any of this, you have to understand what the city of Chicago was built on, and what that meant for everything that came afterward. The blue clay from which the tunnels were carved was so easily worked that men dug 12 feet a night, using no tools fancier than scooping knives. The clay taken up was used to extend Grant Park into the lake, the geology of Chicago, a thick layer of fine-grained glacial clay deposited by the retreat of ice sheets 10,000 years ago, sitting atop a harder layer of till called hardpan, was the city's perpetual structural problem and, as it turned out, its greatest underground gift. The clay was soft enough to carve by hand. It was stable enough to hold its shape once carved. It sat at exactly the right depth, 40 feet below street level, to be excavated without disturbing the foundations of the skyscrapers above or the tangle of utility lines below the surface. This clay layer can be upwards of 50 feet thick in some areas and was the culprit of many building failures, as engineers using spread footings kept pushing the envelope on building heights and noticed severe problems with buildings experiencing differential settlement of several feet. The same material that made Chicago's buildings sink was what made its secret railroad possible. By 1897, the city was already a layered archaeological object, a place where the visible surface bore almost no direct relationship to what lay directly beneath it. The raising of the city in the 1850s and 1860s, the lifting of entire street grids and masonry buildings on jack screws to make room for sewer infrastructure, had left the original ground floor of 19th century Chicago buried under the raised streets. The base of many buildings sits over 10 feet below street level, with empty spaces alongside that sat below the nearby sidewalks as well. These gaps were created by vaulted sidewalks that date back to the same period as the raising of the streets. Property owners found creative uses for the empty spaces beneath the vaulted sidewalks, from outhouses to storage for businesses. In some buildings they used it to store coal. The city had been physically elevated above its own past. The old ground floor of Chicago was now its basement, sealed off by new sidewalks capped over the vaulted gap, used for coal and storage, and the business that needed to stay out of sight. The Great Fire of 1871 had added another layer. On October 8, 1871, the city of Chicago became an inferno. One spark inside a barn sent flames whirling through the city, pushed on by hellish winds and fed by 3 square miles of wooden buildings. When the city emerged from the flames on October 10, about 300 people were dead, 90 Uzuden were homeless, and more than 17,000 buildings were destroyed. Some of the debris was pushed into Lake Michigan as landfill, forming the underpinnings for what is now Grant Park. The ruins of the burnt city were not hauled away and disposed of elsewhere. They were pushed into the lake and built over. Several generations of fill are below your feet as you navigate the streets of Chicago, including patches of cinder-rich debris from the 1871 Chicago fire. The city you walk on is not solid ground, it is compressed history, layer on layer, the original swamp, the raised city of the 1850s, the fire debris of 1871, the infill and reconstruction of the decades after, the utility infrastructure of a booming industrial metropolis, all of it sealed under streets that gave no indication of the depth of what lay below. Beneath Lincoln Park, the situation was starker and stranger still. Roughly 600 bodies were buried at the city cemetery and the adjacent Catholic cemetery. The process of moving the thousands of graves out of the city cemetery began in the mid-1860s, but did not end before the Great Chicago Fire swept through the cemetery in October 1871. The fire destroyed all traces of many graveyard features, leaving no means to account for the remains below. A researcher estimates more than 35,000 people were buried in the area, and the bones of 10,000 to 12,000 bodies remain there to this day. It's almost safe to say that if you dig on Dearborn or State Street, you'll find something. The park where Chicagoans jog and fly kites sits atop an estimated 12,000 forgotten graves, their markers destroyed by fire, their records lost, their locations unrecorded. Occasionally during construction, someone finds them. In 1998, a part of the park was excavated for the Chicago History Museum's parking facility, and the remains of 81 individuals were uncovered. This was the city that existed in 1899 when the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company applied to the Chicago City Council for a franchise to lay telephone cables under the loop. The franchise was granted on February 20, 1899. On February 20, 1899, the City of Chicago granted the newly formed Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company a franchise to construct these tunnels beneath downtown streets, initially presented as utility conduits, but with undisclosed rail capabilities to facilitate freight movement between rail terminals, docks, warehouses, and buildings. The conduits they were permitted to build were supposed to be narrow, just wide enough for telephone cables with a small maintenance passage alongside. What they actually built was something else entirely. Construction of the conduits began in late 1899. However, these were crafted to a size much larger than needed to hold mere wires. Built to a dimension of 7.5 feet high and 6 feet 9 inches wide, they happened to be just large enough to also accommodate a narrow-gauge railway. The city did not notice, or if it noticed, it did not object in time to stop what was already happening beneath its feet. The city was largely unaware of the nature of the tunnelling, and the first 16 miles of tunnel were excavated somewhat covertly, working from the basement of a saloon and carting away the spoil after midnight. 16 miles of tunnels cut in secret by men working the night shift with long knives in clay, so cooperative it gave 12 feet a night. The excavated material loaded onto wagons and taken to the waterfront to extend the city's landfill into Lake Michigan, so that the very act of building the underground city was simultaneously, invisibly, enlarging the surface city's footprint over the water. The company had ties to the Grey Wolves, the faction of Chicago aldermen whose name was synonymous with institutional corruption in the 1890s. The Grey Wolves were corrupt Chicago aldermen who held office from the 1890s to the 1930s. The Chicago City Council frequently gave franchises to private businesses to maintain public services. Many businesses bribed the aldermen to be awarded such contracts, a practice known as boodling. In 1895, the Grey Wolves awarded a franchise to the non-existent Ogden Gas Company, simply to force the existing franchise holder to buy up the rights. This was the political environment in which the telephone conduit franchise was granted, and in which the first 16 miles of underground railroad were built. The city government of Chicago in 1899 was not simply ignorant of what was happening beneath its streets. It was the kind of government that arranged for the right things to be built beneath the right streets by the right people, and then arranged for the discovery to be regularized after the fact. When digging began in 1899, the underground system was supposed to be for phone lines, but the tunnel company secretly began installing a railroad. Upon discovery, there was a bit of a dust-up, but this being Chicago, an ordinance was passed to make the illegal train system legal. The admission came in 1902. Following the company's admission in 1902 that they were building a railroad in their telephone conduits, the City Council began a contentious round of negotiations with the company that resulted in the passage the following year of an ordinance authorizing the operation of the railway with hefty franchise payments going into the municipal coffers. The scandal was resolved not by prosecution but by franchise. The illegal thing was made legal. The block, the whole downtown, every street of the loop was in the end quietly purchased. The price was a franchise fee. The seller was the same city government that had not noticed or had chosen not to notice while 16 miles of tunnels were being dug in the dark from a saloon basement. The Chicago Tunnel Company had an aggressive business strategy, building 60 miles of tunnels before securing a single client. Once the network was complete, they approached downtown buildings and offered an array of services, including telephone and telegraph connections and coal, mail, and merchandise deliveries. Clients included the Board of Trade, City Hall, Merchandise Mart, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Chicago Tribune, the Civic Opera House, the Field Museum, and dozens of others. One of the company's more inventive products was tunnel air, 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which they piped into theatres and hotels as natural air conditioning. The system ran for half a century. It carried coal to the sub-basements of the loop's most famous buildings and carried the resulting ash back out. It moved merchandise, mail, and money. It ran beneath restaurants and offices and banks, beneath the trading floors of the great commodity exchanges, beneath the feet of millions of Chicagoans who had no idea it was there. The whole idea that they built a complex series of tunnels under the city in the early 20th century, and almost nobody knew it was going on, is pretty incredible. And then, as the trucks proved cheaper and cleaner than the underground trains, the system declined. By the late 1950s, the system fell out of use, although some of its 15-mile grid was used to house high-voltage electrical conduits. Otherwise, the system was abandoned, and buildings put bricks or walls over their portals to the tunnels. The bricks went up and the institutional memory dissolved. The people who had known about the tunnels retired or died. The maps were filed away and not updated. The city reorganized its departments, and the knowledge of who was responsible for the abandoned tunnels migrated from person to person until there was no person, and the tunnels had no custodian, and no one in authority could have told you on which street the saloon stood whose basement had served as the entry point for the whole operation in 1899. In January of 1992, a television cable company discovered a leak in the tunnels. They tried to notify James McTeague, who they knew was familiar with the tunnels, but the city had recently reorganized and they couldn't locate him until February. McTeague tracked down the leak, took photos, and showed them to his supervisors in March, explaining that a leaking tunnel under the river could lead to a massive flood. Despite that warning, the city did not expedite repairs. The city rejected an initial repair bid of $10,000 because it considered the cost too high. The repair was scheduled for April 14th. On April 13th, the wall gave way. An estimated 250 million gallons of Chicago River water poured through a crack into the little-used network of tunnels under the loop. The water flooded sub-basements of buildings across downtown. Government and business were brought to a halt when the city's main trading floors shut. Down and City Hall was left unable to function. As the tunnels filled with water, their doors, leading into every major building in the loop, were rusted open. Fish were in the merchandise mart. The Federal Reserve was flooding. It was a really bright sunny April day, and there was a disaster going on, but no one realized it. It was all underground. The story that the title of this piece describes, Something Found While Digging in 1897, a block quietly purchased, is at its core a story about how a city treats what it finds when it opens the ground. Chicago found in the raising of the 1850s that it had built itself too low, and its solution was to lift everything upward and bury the original ground level beneath the raised streets. It found, in the cemetery beneath what is now Lincoln Park, that the dead were inconveniently located, and its solution was to relocate some of them and leave the rest unmarked under the park. It found, in the ruins of the 1871 fire, that it had an enormous quantity of ash and debris, and its solution was to push it into the lake and build Grant Park on top of it. And it found, in 1902, that a private company had been secretly building an underground railroad in fraudulent telephone conduits for 3 years, and its solution was to pass an ordinance and collect a franchise fee. Each discovery produced the same institutional response. The thing found was absorbed, reframed, regularized, and buried again under a new layer of the city. The block was always quietly purchased. The purchase was always an ordinance, a variance, a franchise agreement, a park boundary extended over an unmarked grave. The city of Chicago was built on the principle that what lay beneath the surface was the city's to use, to move, to rebury, to forget. The men who went down through the saloon floor in 1899 with their scooping knives and came back up at midnight with wagon-loads of clay understood this intuitively. They were not violating the city's logic, they were embodying it. The tunnel they were building was simply the latest version of a practice that Chicago had been refining since before the Great Fire, the practice of deciding that what was underground was private, negotiable, and best dealt with quietly.